But thank you all so much for joining us. Best-selling author Allen Eskens will discuss his new thriller, The Quiet Librarian, in this installment of Author Hour in Massachusetts. Allen is the best-selling author of The Life We Bury, The Guise of Another, The Heavens May Fall, The Deep Dark Descending, The Shadows We Hide, Nothing More Dangerous, The Stolen Hours, Forsaken Country, Saving Emma, and his latest novel, his 10th novel, The Quiet Librarian. Allen is the recipient of the Barry Award, the Minnesota Book Award, the Left Coast Crime Award, and the Silver Falchion Award, and has been a finalist for the Edgar Award, the Thriller Award, the Anthony Award, and the Nero Award. His books have been translated into 23 languages. Allen has a journalism degree from the University of Minnesota and a law degree from Hamline University. After law school, he studied creative writing in the MFA program at Minnesota State University, as well as the Loft Literary Center and the Iowa Summer Writers Festival. Allen grew up in the hills of central Missouri. He now lives with his wife, Jolie, in greater Minnesota, where he recently retired after practicing criminal law for 25 years. So all those watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Allen for joining us here tonight. And Allen, thanks so much for being here.
It is a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And hi, everybody.
And Allen, I thought we would start off by you taking maybe 5 to 10 minutes and telling the audience about your origin author story. How did Allen Eskens become a writer?
I would love to. My path to becoming a writer is not the normal path. I was not a kid you would have seen in your libraries. In fact, I don't think I visited a public library until I was in high school. I do not come from a family of readers. I wasn't a reader myself. In fact, I struggled with reading all my life. So when I was in grade school, I was a very poor student. I didn't pay attention. I daydreamed all the time. And daydreaming was not only my escape, but it was my favorite part of school. And it was the thing that I think led me to become an author is that daydreaming. But when I got into high school, on a dare, I auditioned for the school play. And I got in and really had fun. And for the first time in my life, I found something about school that I liked to do, that I was passionate about. And so for 4 years of high school, I did everything I could in theater, choruses, special voice theater classes, all the plays. And it was my love of theater that made me contemplate going to college. I didn't have very good grades, but I wanted to do theater for just a little while longer. My dad owned a drywall company. And so I always kind of figured I'd do construction for the rest of my life. But I thought if I go to college, I can do theater for a couple more years before they kick me out. And so I buckled down and I tried and I got into the University of Iowa. So I grew up in Missouri and I went to college in Iowa. And once I got to college, I really loved college. I loved being there. And I realized that if I was going to stay in college, I needed to understand how to learn, how to study, how to be a better student. And so I had to do so much remedial work, learning grammar, stuff that I should have been paying attention to in high school but wasn't. Learning how to read textbooks and study for tests. And at the end of my 4 years of college, I switched to journalism degree. By the time I graduated, I was a straight A student. So in that gap of time, I went from thinking I was too stupid to be in college to being a straight A student at the end. And really with that as my motivation is that I wanted to see if I could do it from the beginning. So I went to law school. I never dreamed of being a lawyer, but I wanted to just see if I could do it, if I really was smart. And I excelled in law school. I did really, really well. Graduated from law school, got a job, passed the bar. And that first summer out of law school, I was sitting at my desk and something was missing. And what was missing was that creative side that I'd worked so hard and fell in love with in high school and college. And I wanted to do something creative just for me. And so I started writing a short story. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know how to write. I didn't know story structure, didn't know anything about it, but I just started writing a short story. And when I finished, I liked the story. It was not good, but I liked it. And so I bought a book on writing technique. Actually, it was Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Um, and it was about story structure. And I read that book and I became fascinated with storytelling. And now all this daydreaming that I've been doing my whole life seemed to have a purpose. So I worked on that short story and I kept working on it. And I started taking classes and reading more books and more books on writing technique. And I found that I had a passion for writing. I still struggle with reading. I've never been a good reader, but I still struggle with reading. But I love telling stories. And so for 20 years, I wrote that one manuscript and took hundreds of classes and read dozens of books on writing just to become a better writer for my own benefit. In the back of my mind, I thought, someday I'd like to get published, but that was not at the forefront of why I was doing this. It was just because I enjoyed the storytelling aspect of it. After 20 years of working on that one manuscript, it wasn't ready. I put it aside and I had another idea for a story. So I wrote that one, and that became my debut novel, The Life We Bury, which is right here. And that's the book that got me on the map. When it was published, I was nominated for multiple awards. It became a bestseller, and I haven't looked back. It's just been, so much fun to take this hobby that I've been doing, since 1992, and this daydreaming that I've been doing my whole life, and make a living out of it. That first short story that became a manuscript became my sixth novel, which is called Nothing More Dangerous. So right there. Um, so I eventually did publish it. And now I have my 10th novel out, which is The Quiet Librarian. So while I love libraries and I adore going there and speaking at them, the first time that I can remember going to a public library was when I was in theater in high school and I found out that they had records. They had show tune albums. And so I checked out all these show tune albums and memorized them and sang the songs and studied them because I just loved everything about, musical theater. So that's my journey to becoming a writer. It is different than most, but it's been very, very rewarding.
But Alan, I think we're going to circle back to some of that towards the end of the conversation. But the next question I wanted to ask you, this is a twofold question. First of all, without delving too much into the war, because that'll be my next question, can you tell us a bit about what the Quiet Librarian is about?
It came about, I was about to go to a library event and speak, and I had some time to kill. So I sat down and turned on the TV, and there was a movie on called The Reader. And if you've seen The Reader or read the book, it's about a middle-aged woman in post-World War II Germany. And you get to know her, at least in the movie, a certain way. And then about a third of the way into the movie, you learn a secret about her past. And just learning that secret changed how I saw her. She hadn't changed. She was still the same character, but knowing that secret changed how I felt about her. And I got in my car and I was driving to this event and I was thinking about that. If I were going to write a story about a woman who had a secret that if you knew that secret, it would change how you saw her, what would it be? And I think my character became a librarian because I was on my way to a library event, more than anything else. She wants to live a quiet life, so that seemed to fit. But she has a secret, and the secret is she came of age in Bosnia during the war in 1992 to 1995. And she was thrust into this war and became a fighter and something of a legend and had to flee. And she's been hiding in the United States for 30 years. And the story begins with a detective walking into her library to ask her questions about the death of her best friend, Amina. And Hana, my character, understands or believes that someone from her past has come looking for her. And now she needs to go back and find that person she was during the war and find the threat that's after her.
Now, can we just take a step back, Alan? What can you tell us about the Bosnian War? I was in middle school while it was happening. I feel like I never got a proper education on it, if I'm being honest. I lived through it, but I don't know much about it, sad to say. I'm probably like most Americans. Can you tell us a bit about the Bosnian War?
Yes, I could tell you a lot more about the Bosnian War. Uh, so when I started researching her past, I come up with her coming of age in Bosnia just because I knew that that was timeline wise the right time. So she would have been a teenager in the 1990s. And then I started researching it. Now, in 1984, we had the Winter Olympics in Sarajevo, and Yugoslavia was a very proud country, but it was a country made up of all these different republics, and it was held together by a guy named Tito, a dictator. When Tito dies, the different republics decide we're going to break away from Belgrade and be our own countries again. And that started the wars. The first one was Slovenia. They had a 10-day war and they were out. And then Croatia said, well, if they can do it, we can do it. So Croatia said, we're declaring independence. And by the time Bosnia declared independence, Belgrade, the Serbians, had decided we're not going to let anybody else go. And in particular, Bosnia was really, really bad because you had Bosnians who were Muslims living right next door to Serbians who were Christians. And it was not a matter of territory or land. It was a matter of cultures. The Serbians were going to eliminate the Bosnian culture from the country. And so it became an ethnic cleansing. And because of that, the tactics that were used went well beyond your normal warfare. And that's where the atrocities came in. So as I was researching this to understand just the culture and the timing of the war and what it was like, I came to understand that the backstory of what happened in Bosnia couldn't just be a backstory. It had to be so much more. And when I first started writing this, it was going to be a mystery thriller. And the more I researched it, the more I realized that half of this book was going to be historical fiction. And to really get it right, I reached out to the Bosniak refugee community in Minneapolis, as well as the University of Minnesota, to try and find people who could help me understand it. And I got two people who agreed to volunteer to help me. And boy, was that an amazing journey. Sitting with them and listening to them talk about what it was like to be in that world at that time. One of them was a female growing up in Banja Luka. Banja Luka was a Serbian-held city, but she was Bosnian, which means she was surrounded by the enemy all the time. And there were a number of occasions where she thought she was not going to survive the day. And her family finally escaped and got out of there. The other one was a guy who was defending Srebrenica. Srebrenica was under siege. It was a Bosnian city, but it was under siege by the Serbs for much of the war. And when it fell, uh, my source, Elvir, he saw the helicopters come in to take the generals and the colonels away. So he knew the city was going to fall. And so he and a friend came up with a plan to swim the river and head into Serbian territory and surrender. And they did that, and they were put in prison camps. And that is why they survived. When the Serbs came into Srebrenica, they massacred 8,000 men and boys. And Elvir would have been one of those had he not come up with this audacious plan to surrender in Serbia. So I'm listening to these two people talk about this incredible time of their lives, and that's when I realized that this had to be more than just a mystery thriller. It had to really contain the story of what it was like to live in that world. And so to understand what Hannah is doing today, you need to understand what she was like in 1995 during the war.
Yeah, and those war scenes were just, brutal. And I think it's okay to go there since it's in the official description of the book. But she loses her, father, her mother, her 8-year-old brother. She witnesses it all essentially. Just horrific scenes. You do a wonderful job of capturing the horror and the tragedy. Um, I did want to ask you. So this is a this book is, like you said, half thriller mystery and half historical fiction, and there's some romance with both stories, but it's essentially two stories connected, and you're telling them in parallel. So the first chapter, we're in, say, current day Minnesota or whatnot, and then the second chapter we're back in Bosnia. Curious, did you write those stories separate from one another, or were you writing them as they appeared on the page?
I wrote them separately. I understood, but first of all, I'm a plotter. So before I sit down to write that first chapter, I have spent a long time plotting out the stories and how each chapter is going to lay out next to each other. So I knew each of the storylines, but I knew the backstory best. I knew the Bosnian story best, and I also knew that it was more set in stone in terms of what had to happen. I had flexibility with the present day story, so I wrote the Bosnian side of the story first. By doing that, you also get um, a connectivity between those chapters. Even though you're going to go from Bosnia to Minnesota to Bosnia, there's there's a connection between those chapters, the Bosnian chapters, because I've written them back to back. Then I went and wrote the current day story, the present day investigation mystery part of it, and then spliced them together. And I
Right.
did, if I can add, one of the things that I wanted to do as I'm doing that is I wanted to have a little talisman, a little connection between the past and the present chapters. So, for example, Hana, when she's in Bosnia, her name is Nora. So when Nora meets a boy and they have a scene where they kiss, the next scene is Hana in the present day having dinner with a man, and that's out of the ordinary for her. And there's there's a reaction to her being with this man that is similar to the reaction of her being with that boy back in Bosnia. And so I wanted to have connections between those chapters so that um, subconsciously, at least, it would flow from one to the other, even though you're going back and forth in time.
And you do a great job with it, absolutely. I did want to, speaking of splicing things in, I did want to splice in some brief reviews. I did want to note that this book was received a starred review from Booklist. It doesn't get any better than starred review, and I'll just read briefly. This is no typical whodunit. This is an intense and emotional story about grief, loss, and the horrors of war. Hana is a compelling character readers can't help but root for, even if they disagree with her actions. This book is perfect for fans of intense mysteries and for those who like fiction featuring real life history. And again, comes from a starred review from Booklist, which is one of the library journals that we rely on. Alan, as we move along here, what has the reception been for the book? I know the book's been out now for nearly a month. How are things going on your end?
I'm very pleased with the reception. People are finding that it is intense because I wanted to be as realistic as I could about what was happening in Bosnia. I used incidences that were consistent with what was happening back then. And so there is some rawness to that side, but there's also some very gentle and wonderful aspects to the story. Nura meets a boy, and those scenes are very touching, and I loved writing those scenes. But yeah, people are saying wonderful things about it. I can't thank them enough.
I don't want to go too far into spoilers. I know he's not on the back cover. Can you talk a little bit about David, though? I was really rooting for David. I liked David.
Um, David, he is a very understanding and compassionate detective, but he's also a man who has reached a point in his career where he just feels like he's going through the motions. As an attorney, when I first came out of law school, I was so enthusiastic, and every case was exciting and challenging. After 25 years, it was okay, come in, have a seat, tell me why you're here, I'll represent you. I knew the law backwards and forwards. It just didn't hold the same. It wasn't inspiring anymore. And David finds, when he meets Hannah, a reason to be inspired again, I guess is a good way to say it. To go back to his core of right and wrong and justice, and why he became a cop to begin with. And yeah, he's a good guy.
So, Alan, obviously, the bulk of the research for the book was focused on the Bosnian Wars. Did you do any research regarding working in a public library? And if so, and I know, we meet Hannah, and maybe for the first 5 to 10 chapters, she's you know in the library, or there's references to libraries, and I know after a certain point things kind of take off. But for that first beginning of the book, any research went into any of that?
My wife was actually an assistant librarian for a while. She just in the center here, local town. She was like a sub for a number of different librarians, and so it was not hard to do research for that part of it. Also, I have done presentations at so many libraries, and I've met so many wonderful librarians. I feel very, very comfortable with my being in a library now.
Yeah. So, folks, we'll circle back to questions specific to the Quiet Librarian once we get to audience questions. But let me ask some questions about your writing process. You touched on the fact that you are a plotter as opposed to a pantser. Alan, generally speaking, how long does it take you to write one of your 10 novels? Walk us through a day in the life of Alan, and then walk us through maybe sort of the timeline to publish a book.
Okay. The timeline for writing a book can vary anywhere from 1 year to 27 years for me.
Right.
But after I wrote The Life We Bury and the follow-up novel, The Guise of Another, I felt fairly comfortable with my abilities as a writer. And so I could do a book a year if I wanted to. What I normally do is when I turn in a manuscript to my editor, I disengage my brain from that manuscript, and I start thinking seriously about the next one. Now, I have been thinking about this next novel off and on for it could be a year, it could be 5 years, 10 years. It's an idea that kind of sticks with me, but I don't really devote my brain to that until, okay, this manuscript is with the publisher. Now let's sit down and outline the next one. And now I daydream. I sit there with a sketchbook in front of me. And the sketchbook helps me organize. It helps me slow down my thoughts. Also, I like the big white spaces. So I don't feel like I'm thinking too linearly as I'm doing this. I'll write down my ideas, turn the page, filter the ideas, percolate them. By the time I get to the end of the sketchbook, I have all my plot points laid out. Here's what each chapter is going to be about. That's my roadmap. Now I turn to my craft. I've studied writing for decades, and I sit down. I know what each chapter is about. I know I have confidence in my writing. So I ask myself a few starter questions. What's at stake in this chapter? What's the desire of the characters? What's the obstacle in their way? How do they change over the course of this chapter? And it doesn't have to be a big change. It could be, they came into the chapter curious about something, they leave knowing it. They came in happy, they leave sad. I want there to be some change in the character over the course of the chapter. And then it's just a matter of letting my daydream go and writing. I'll try and write about 1,000 words a day when I'm doing a first draft. Uh, I get a first draft done in about 4 months at that pace. Then I revise. When I think the revisions are all done, I give it to my wife. She reads it. Then she gives it back to me, and I fix what she tells me to fix. Then I give it to my agent, do the same thing with her, and then I give it to my editor. And again, when I give it to my editor, now my brain is free to think about the next novel. So that's a pace that I was doing for quite a while. Um, when I finished The Quiet Librarian, though, I needed a break. I wasn't ready to write another novel. So I spent this past year doing screenplays just for the fun of it. And waiting for I had a few ideas in my head, waiting for one of them to really grab hold. And when one did, I'm back in that process now.
Yeah, so the Bosnian War, think it, let me pull up my fact sheet here. So it displaced over 2.2 million people. More than 1,000 people are estimated to have been killed. And then between 15,000 and 50,000 women were raped. All these terrible things. And that brings me to, let's see here, Susan's question. How did you researching the war affect you as a writer and as a person?
As a writer, again, I entered this process thinking I was going to write a mystery thriller. And there was a certain reverence, I guess is the word that I keep coming back to. When I am researching what happened there, this couldn't just be something I used as a backstory in a mystery thriller. I felt an obligation to tell a story about what happened over there without being preachy about it. But I wanted people to know these things happened. I was I was here in the 1990s. I was in my 30s. I was politically aware. I would see this stuff on the news and I would just disengage my brain. That's not me. It's not part of my world. I'm trying to build a law practice, raise a family. I don't need that extra heavy weight. And so I ignored it, as did so many people. And I thought if I can tell this story in a way that engages people, they might come away with an understanding of, what that war was about. Not That's not the purpose of the novel, but it is something that I hadn't planned when I started it, but it's something that I wanted to have happen when people close the book. I want people to close this book and just take a moment before they open the next book and think about this story. Some people call it a book hangover. I would love to have people just take a moment to think, wow, that happened. You know, now I'm a little more aware of it. So yeah, it did affect me.
And did you say that's why, in part, you took a break from writing after you finished the book?
It was an intense book to write. And
Yeah.
so it was hard to finish that book and then step into another book because that one was still in my head. And I couldn't move on right away because there was so much about that book that stayed with me having written it.
So, Alan, let me ask you this: you're more well known for thrillers and mysteries and suspense. In your opinion, what are the key ingredients to a successful thriller book?
My answer is probably going to differ from everybody else's. So when I was first studying writing, it wasn't with the idea that I was going to be a mystery writer. I just wanted to tell stories in a way that evoked something, that made people feel something, that made me feel something. And so that's where I focused my energy in terms of understanding the craft of writing. I was going to be a literary novelist, but at the same time, I was a practicing criminal defense attorney, and I would read mysteries and thrillers, and I would come away thinking, okay, that was intellectually interesting. There were some twists and turns in that, but I didn't feel anything. And so I actually thought I was never going to be a mystery writer. I was opposed to it because I thought that's what a mystery writer did is twists and turns and clever, reveals and that kind of thing. And then I read Mystic River by Dennis Lehane, voted one of the best mysteries ever written. And if you break it down, the solving of the mystery is really not that deep. It is a story about people. It's a story about these three kids. Something happens to one of them when they're, I think, 11 years old. Then, when they are adults, that event that happened to them when they were 11 affects how they approach when one of them loses their daughter is killed. And you can see how what happened at age 11 kind of dictated who they became and how they dealt with this incident. And I thought that was so fascinating that people thought that was a mystery. To me, it was a human story. It was a story of relationships. And I thought, if that's a mystery, then that's what I want to do. I want to write mysteries, but the mystery is going to be a vehicle to tell another story. So in this book, Hannah is trying to figure out who killed her friend. And she believes it's someone from her past, someone from Bosnia. And that's the vehicle I use to tell the story of what happened to her in Bosnia and how she became this extraordinary person after, having tragedy strike her. So my view of a good thriller or a good mystery is that it goes well beyond the thriller or the mystery. It goes into deeper themes, relationships, family, dramas. There's more to it than just twists and turns. You're muted.
Sorry about that. The Quiet Librarian is a standalone, and it's hard for me to envision it becoming a series. I think Nothing More Dangerous is also a standalone, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. And then all your other books are part of series. Is that right? So the Talbert series and the Rupert series?
In a way. So my debut novel, The Life We Bury, I have four characters in there. There's a protagonist, Joe Talbert, his girlfriend, Lila Nash. There's a cop named Max Rupert. His his portion of the story is maybe 20%. And then there's a law professor, Bodhi Sandin, and he's in there for just like two or three scenes. And I wanted to tell their stories going forward. So I've written about a community of characters that sometimes come in and out of each other's story. I've got a book called The Heavens May Fall, where Bodhi's on one side of a case, Max is on the other. Lila Nash is in law school and she's researching for Bodhi. So So if it makes sense, I will have them come in and out of each other's story. Otherwise, they just go off, and have their own stories told. Now, Nothing More Dangerous, which is the book that I wrote for 20 years, that's actually Bodhi's backstory.
Okay.
That's Bodhi, the law professor from The Life We Bury, but he's 15 years old in 1976. So I actually created that character first, the 15-year-old. And then when I was writing The Life We Bury and I was creating this law professor, it dawned on me that this kid that I'd written about that was in my drawer was actually who I was when I was 15, or aspects of who I was at 15. And this law professor in The Life We Bury was aspects of who I was at that time, who I became. And so that's how Bodhi Sandin became the law professor in The Life We Bury. Um, it's a prequel. Nothing More Dangerous is a prequel to Bodhi's other stories.
So the Bodhi Talbert Rupert universe is the Quiet Librarian the first book not published within that universe for you?
It is. And I thought about trying to connect it, but this was going to be a very different book for me. And I thought I could connect it somehow, but like maybe having one of the other minor characters from another book make an appearance, but I just thought there's no purpose behind that. There's no reason for that. This is going to be a true standalone, and that's what I did.
So I'm going to read a review and then we're going to get to audience questions. But before we do all that, now you have me interested. Allen, if you can let us know, maybe you can't, but what are you working on now? What's next for Allen?
Uh, well, I'm in the outlining stage right now. I have a story that it was sitting in the back of my mind for some time. I have a character named Nikki Bang. She's Mung, and she was Max Rupert's partner when he was a detective. And I really like Nikki. She appears in 4 of the books. In The Stolen Hours, she's a point of view, but she's not the main protagonist. And I really like Nikki, and I've wanted to do a story for her for some time, but I've held back. And one of the reasons I held back was because I don't know the Hmong community, and I don't want to feel like I'm stepping on toes by writing about this character that's Hmong. Um, but the other day I was doing a book event, and someone in the audience said, "You really need to write a story about Nikki Vang." And I said, "I know. I need someone who can help me understand the Hmong community." And this woman raised her hand and said, "I'm Hmong. I'll help you." So I'm really excited now because like in the Quiet Librarian, I have someone from that world who will sit down with me, introduce me to other people from that world, talk to me about, customs and history, and just the minutia of understanding that character before I write the novel for her.
So let me quickly read a brief review. So, in addition to receiving a starred review in Book List, you also received a starred review in Library Journal. And they write in part, fans of Kristen Hanna's The Nightingale or Kate Quinn's books will be caught up in this story of a courageous woman. And again, that's a starred review from Library Journal. In addition, you are also an editor's pick on Amazon, one of the best mystery, thriller, and suspense books for February. And, nothing to sneeze at, a 4.3 rating, folks, on Goodreads. So let's not dismiss that. All right, so now we'll get to audience questions. If you have any questions, please get them into the Q&A box. If you have any comments, please get them into the chat box. I see a few already. So Alana wants to know, how were you able to excel in law school if, as you say, you had trouble with reading?
That's a very good question. So when I was in undergrad and I realized that I had to figure out how to become a better student, I would go to the used bookstore because number one, I was broke, but also I would sit there and I would compare the textbooks for a particular class and I would look for the highlighting. I'd look to see who I thought did a really good job of highlighting what was important. So I'd read a chapter or two and just check that out. And then I'd buy the book that was well highlighted. and then I would read the highlights and take the tests. And then by the time I got to law school, I was really good at that. And I did the same thing. I would buy used books for in law school, but also in law school, they have these um, Barbary books and nutshell books where you can buy a book that says, here's the bare bones of what you need to know about these cases and this law. And I spent my time with those. I had a really good analytical mind, which I didn't know until I went to law school. So I was able to take the lessons that I was learning from these summary books and apply it to facts in a test really, really well. So I was able to cut out a lot of the actual reading, but I still got to the heart and soul of what the case was about and understanding the precedent that it was setting, and then being able to apply that in other instances. So it worked out. It was I was actually kind of nervous about that because I mean you get to law school and you have a textbook this thick just for one class. It's intimidating, but um, I was able to work around it.
Alan, this is sort of a minor spoiler for the plot, but I do want to ask you this question since you are a lawyer. So, A, you wrote the book, and B, you're a retired, longtime criminal attorney. So, I wanted to ask you this question, and this goes along with something is asking in the chat there. So, if there's an instance where I am seeing a therapist and I am murdered and it is likely possible, maybe likely, that what I have discussed with my therapist is somehow related to my murder. You know, and the so why is it so difficult for the police to get the records from the therapist to potentially solve my case? I'm murdered. I don't care about patient confidentiality at that point. I'm dead. So, and you see this pop up on TV shows and films, and why is the law the way it is?
So it's a gray area. Uh, Technically, yes, once your patient dies, there's no strict doctor-patient privilege, but that patient is going to have heirs. They're going to have relatives that if you start talking about them, you might get sued. And so, actually, in The Quiet Librarian, there was a therapist involved in that book who simply said, "I need a subpoena. Uh, you know, Before you can have these records, I have to have something in my file to say I follow the law so that I don't get sued." So it was just more something that we call it CYA, cover your ass. So they're covering their ass so they don't get a lawsuit for disclosing something that is embarrassing that their heirs or relatives would be mad about.
Gotcha. It's always a pet peeve of mine when I am watching episodes of Law and Order. All right. So Alana asks, how did the people and situations you encountered in your work in the law impact your writing in terms of content, style, and time management?
Uh, so when I write my mystery novels, that uh, I know how police procedure works. I know how courtroom procedure works. I know the rules of evidence. I've been in courtrooms. I've argued to juries. I've argued to Supreme Courts. So there's never an instance where I have a character in a situation like that I don't know. Well, at least 7 years ago, I didn't know exactly how it would play out. Having been out of law for 8 years now, I'm a little rusty. But also, every now and again, I will have a memory of a case where it inspires a novel. So I had a case when I was a young attorney at the security hospital, which is where you go when you have been found not guilty by reason of insanity. And I had a client there who thought he was a prophet. And this guy fascinated me. It's not unusual to have people in mental hospitals who think they are prophets or talk to God or Jesus. What was unusual about this guy was that he was very intelligent, very articulate, and that impressed me. And years later, when I was thinking about ideas for novels, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to have a character like that who thinks he's a prophet, and on the other side of the case, you have Bodhi Sandin, who is a disgruntled ex-Catholic. Put them in a room and have them talk about religion. Uh, that's not the main plot, but it was just kind of a subplot that I found interesting, and that kind of inspired the idea for the novel Saving Emma. So I do have cases in my memory that I that were just fascinating. A lot of it was public information, you know, and I would use it to my advantage when I was trying to find like secondary plots or little, you know, anecdotes to throw in my novels.
Yeah, I was wondering if we were going to get any sort of courtroom scene, and we did get one. So Jim asks, "I'm totally flabbergasted by your journey to becoming a writer from dreamer to writer. Is The Quiet Librarian the first book you found yourself needing to write half of it as historical fiction?" I think the answer to that is yes, if I'm not mistaken. But let me also ask, now are you planning, and it sounds like you'll be broadening your horizons and maybe writing books in other genres besides mystery, thriller, and suspense.
I have an idea for a novel that is purely historical fiction. I'm not ready to write it yet, but it is a story that has fascinated me for some time. I will write it someday. The next novel I write is going to have aspects of historical fiction. So in The Life We Bury, there's some flashback scenes to Vietnam. So even though it's not historical fiction, uh, there's aspects of history in these flashback scenes. The next novel I write will most likely have that kind of flashback to historical fiction incidents that happened in the 1970s. So, and Nothing More Dangerous was written about 1976. So that, I guess it's historical fiction. I don't know yeah, it's historical fiction. So it takes place in 1976, but it really is a coming of age story uh, more than it's historical fiction, I believe, in my own head at least.
Susan asks, when your stories are very emotional and based on realistic happenings, how long does it take for you to move on?
Well, in this case, it took a year.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I was dabbling with other things. I've been writing screenplays just for the fun of it, like I did for novel writing for 20 years. I've been writing screenplays on the side just for my own edification. And I finished one and wrote two over the course of the last 12 months, um, just to keep my feet in the water there. And while I was doing that, I was refreshing my brain to get ready for the next novel. Normally, I finish a novel and I'm already, starting the next novel right away, but this one I just needed a break.
So Susan is in a book club in Minneapolis, near your neck of the woods. And she was wondering, do you ever speak to book clubs?
I do speak to book clubs primarily through Zoom now.
Sure.
I'm in Mankato, so I'm a good hour and a half south of the Twin Cities, or from Minneapolis at least. So to take 3 hours out of my day to go up and also 2 hours of being at the book club,
Sure.
if I did that all the time, I would never get any writing done.
Understood. So he is available, but via Zoom, Susan. Okay, that answers that question. All right, well, we start to wind things down. Allen, where can folks learn more about you? Are you on social media? Do you have a website, a newsletter? Where can folks find out more about you?
I do have a website. It's alleneskens.com. Uh, I have a newsletter. I don't use it that often. I think I used it when the Quiet Librarian came out for the first time in like 3 years. But please sign up for it because I do plan on using it more often now. I'm on uh, Facebook, Allen Eskens author. You can follow me there. You can follow me on Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. I'm rather new at TikTok, but I do so enjoy seeing people go on TikTok and Instagram and speak well of my books, that just makes my day. I can't tell you uh, how nice it is to open your computer in the morning and see someone with a nice review on Instagram or a nice, shout out on TikTok or something like that.
Yeah, there is something about that. You see thousands of reviews, nice reviews written on Goodreads, but when you see someone verbalizing it on Instagram or TikTok, it means more for some reason. Let's see here. So, anonymous attendee asks, when it comes to cultural research on a novel, such as the character you mentioned earlier, do you gather a broad scope of the culture and then narrow it down for a specific scenario already in your brain? Or do you start from a specific scenario and build the research based off that scenario's need?
A little of both. When I was first researching Hannah's background, I had a pretty good idea of what was going to be her path in Bosnia, but I didn't understand Bosnia. I didn't understand the war. So the first thing I did was, you know, when did Bosnia first enter the war? When did the war end? What were some of the main things that happened during the war? I watched all these YouTube videos that were like, ABC and Associated Press news clips from the war, so I get a feel for what the countryside looked like, for what the people wore, and just kind of immerse myself in the culture. And I did that for several months before I realized I needed more specific help on things like names. Names in this novel were very specific. Uh, if you said, "My name is Nura," people would know you were Bosnian. If you said, "My name is Mora," they would know you were Serbian. Um, they would know you by your name. Having those people help me made me understand that. Also, things like, where is the water heater in a house in the Bosnian countryside? Is it in the basement or is it in the bathroom? I initially put it in the basement, and one of my readers said, no, it'd most likely be in the bathroom. What did they eat? What's a Muslim funeral like? Just all these little things. I had Nura snaring a squirrel, I think it was. And she said, no, it'd most likely be a rabbit, or vice versa. I can't remember which one it was, but I had the wrong animal. She says, it's most likely to be, the other animal. So that was where I get to the more specific stuff. But I started with a basic understanding of, here's the journey this person's going to take. Now let's understand the world. And then I focus more specifically down on the finer points.
Alan, by the way, did you ever consider giving a different occupation to Hannah, or was it always going to be a librarian?
It was always a librarian, and I don't know why. I think primarily because she wants to have a quiet life,
Yeah.
and I associate quiet life with librarians. That when you're there, it's peaceful, it's somber, it's you know, unless the kids are just out of school, whatever. But for the most part, it's a nice, peaceful place, and that's what she's looking for. She's looking for a peaceful place where she can go to work, do her job, be left alone, go home, and live in the past. Basically, is what she was doing.
Final question, Alan. Do you have any general advice for aspiring writers? What's one or two pieces of advice you'd leave them?
The thing that helped me the most was the years that I spent studying the craft of writing. Um, John Gardner had once written something like, you either have talent or you don't, and you should find out right away which one it is so you don't live a frustrated life. I wanted to put my stories on paper, whether I had talent or not. And so I thought, I'm just going to learn the craft so well that it doesn't matter if I have natural born talent. I will write a good story because I understand the craft. And there is so much to the craft of writing that I had no idea about when I first started writing. There's a whole, second, third, and fourth level of understanding, how to tell a story in a way that gets past a person's neocortex and into the limbic system to make them feel something by the end of the story.
Mary says, thank you. This was one of the most interesting author talks I've heard in a while, and I look forward to reading the book. Can't say enough good things about the book. I highly recommend it. So, Allen, thank you so much for giving an hour of your time to us. We greatly appreciate it. Folks, look for an email from me later tonight with a link to the recording, as well as information on how you can purchase the book from Wellesley Books. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Thanks again, Allen.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.